Hi, welcome to our first online class of Introduction to Literature, specifically poetry, which is a condensed form of literature. Everything you can learn in a literature class, you can learn through poetry. And also we did the beginning of, or the importance of story and learning how stories are built. You have just finished your third book in the Wrinkle in Time series. I hope you really enjoyed it, but that's the last novel we'll be reading together this year. I would like to encourage you to continue the series. There's two more books in the quintet. So give it a shot. If you enjoyed the first three books, you should enjoy the last two as well. And I'll be giving that a look through as well. Okay, today we're going to go back into poetry and we're going to be discussing tone. Tone is very important to poetry. It is the attitude of the writer towards the subject or his audience. So in this little graphic here, we see that tone indicates the writer's attitude. Often the author's tone is described by adjectives such as cynical. Cynical means you don't really believe what you're saying or what somebody else is saying. Depressed, sympathetic, cheerful, outraged, positive, angry, sarcastic, prayerful, ironic. That means there's a little bit of, you didn't see it coming. Solemn, vindictive, you're angry and you want to get back at somebody. Intense or excited. So when we read poetry, one of the things we're looking at is the author's tone. What is the author's feeling towards their subject? And we're going to start with a really great poem today called Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. Robert Hayden wrote this incredible poem that we can still appreciate today. Wrote it back during the Depression, actually. And he was one of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance. So he begins his poem with this. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put on his clothes in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from the labor of the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Okay, the way we do it in the classroom is the same way we're going to do it online. We are going to take this apart line by line so we can really understand what the poem is about. So he starts with Sundays, too, my father got up early. By the fact that he says "to" as a second word, we get the impression that this man, the father, gets up every day early. Okay, but he doesn't get a day off. He doesn't get a Sunday off. He gets Sunday, too, he gets up early. And what does he do first thing? He puts on his clothes. But his clothes are being put on in the blue-black cold. The idea that it is so cold it even has a color to it. It's dense. It is striking. And then with cracked hands that ached, made banked fires blaze. If you've ever been out in the cold, I know we're in Southern California, so we don't get a lot of snow. But every time it hails, we always send students outside to go play in the hail. You know, it's a little teeny tiny BB size hail. But you know, if you've ever visited the snow area or played in the hail, you understand that after touching the snow or the hail for just a short period of time, your hands burn. Okay, now imagine you're living in a place like you see on this page where you've got this snow-covered cabin. The idea that you'd be out in the weekday weather, in the cold, and your hands just aching from being in the cold. Even with gloves on, you can get that achy cold. But his hands are cracked. They're dry. They're bleeding. But every day he's putting on his clothes in the cold, in the blue-black cold with cracked hands that ached. And then look at what makes them ache. It's the labor from the weekday weather. But what does he do with those cracked, aching hands? He stirs up the fire. That's the banked fire. They're banked with ashes, and he stirs up the coals so that they're hot and so that they'll catch fire. And he creates these lovely warm fires in the fireplaces and stoves. So that's what he does. He's the first one up. He's the first one to get dressed, and then he warms the house for everyone else. But then look at the second part of that fifth line. No one ever thanked him. Can you imagine? Every day, getting up, never getting a break, getting up every day, early, in the cold, getting dressed, your hands sore, aching, cracked, and then stirring up the fire, making sure that the house is ready for the rest of your family, and no one ever thanks you. No one ever says, wow, thanks, Dad. So now we go to the child's still attitude and his tone. We're going for his narration here where he says, I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. This idea that the rooms are so cold that when they start to warm up, we hear creaks and snaps as the cold is being driven out by the new warmth. When the rooms were warm, you notice that Dad doesn't wake everybody up in the ice cold morning when he's up. He waits until the rooms are warm. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. The child who is speaking, the narrator who's speaking here, is saying, you know what? I'd wake and I'd hear the cold splintering and cracking. I would wait until my father called me. And then when he did call me, I would get out of the bed so slowly and dress. And then we get the little bit of a hint as why he's moving so slowly. He's afraid. As a child waking up in this house, he is afraid when he wakes up in the morning. He is fearing the chronic angers of the house. But look at how he presents his fear. He presents it with indifference. He says, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold. And that means when he talks to his dad, when he deigns to speak to him, he speaks to him like Dad doesn't matter. He says, I speak indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. So Dad, who is up early with aching hands, setting up the fireplace, waiting until the room is warm before calling everybody out. And then on top of that, he's polishing the shoes of his son. And the son's only reaction to him is, my dad's angry. That makes me angry. So I will speak indifferently to him like he doesn't matter. And then the last two lines flip the whole poem when the narrator says, what did I know? He's looking back on his childhood and saying, wow, I was a jerk. What did I know? Here I was in this house with my dad all those years, and I didn't figure it out. I just assumed my dad was ticked off. He was angry. The house was always full of anger, and that made me angry and made me indifferent. And then at the very end of the poem, he says, I was wrong. I didn't know. What did I know? What did I know of love? And specifically, love's austere meaning very bare bones basic, and lonely, you all know what lonely means, offices. An office in this case would be the job, the responsibility. He says, what did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? As a grown man looking back on his childhood, he is saying, kind of musing to himself, my goodness, here I was surrounded by a man, living in a house with a man who showed me love every day, even on Sundays, when he got up early in the blue, black cold, when he started the fires, when he waked me after the rooms were warm and polished my shoes. And I spoke indifferently to him, like he didn't matter. Now I look back at that and go, I didn't get it. I didn't get that was my father showing me love. And here's where that tone sets in. Remember why the kid was so afraid in the morning? Because there was chronic anger in the house. There was a reason for that chronic anger. It was because the father was treated indifferently. The father went out of his way to take care of his family, and yet the family treated him like he didn't matter, like all of his hard work, all of his effort. Every time he addressed that austere and lonely office of love toward his family by doing something as simple as getting up early, starting the fire, waiting for the rooms to warm, polishing his son's shoes. And they never looked at him and said, "Thank you. We appreciate what you do." So what is the tone? Is it anger? Is it regretful? We have to look at the whole poem. There's actually several tones in this poem. You let me know what they are on your homework. Okay, so when we talk about these winter Sundays, and now that we understand a little bit better line by line what it means, let's read it through one more time and really get the beauty of this poem as well as the sadness. Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold, and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So the speaker in this poem is a grown man looking back on his childhood. Now that he has a little more idea of what life expects out of us, he can look back on his childhood and go, wow, okay, I wasn't mature enough to get it then, but I can get it now. So now that he's an adult, he better knows why his father acted the way he did, being a little angry, having a chronic anger. At first, the poem looks like the chores performed by the father are just the chores performed by the father, but then it becomes clear that while the father is serving his family in turn is ungrateful. They speak to him indifferently or without interest or concern, not caring, apathetic, and the result is anger. That's a chronic or constant anger in the house. The father is angry because he's not appreciated. The children are angry because the father is angry, and that just becomes this long, busy cycle. Okay, now we can actually apply this biblically. In Joshua 23:16, we read, "When you have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed yourselves to them, then shall the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and ye shall perish quickly from off the good land which he hath given unto you." We often talk about God being God our Father. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who read the Old Testament and all they see is God is this big bad. He is just so angry. The God of the Old Testament, he's just, is sending down lightning bolts and fire and opening pits and throwing people in. It's like, there's a lot more to the God of the Old Testament. In Joshua 23:16, he gives us a little bit of a clue as to why God might be angry with his own people. You see, he was their father. They were his children. He adopted them as his children, as his people. He made sure that they had protection while they were in captivity. He made sure that they got out of that captivity. He brought them into a promised land flowing with milk and honey. He allowed them to take over that land and live in homes that they didn't build, in cities they didn't build, eating fruit from trees they didn't plant. He provided completely for them. But Joshua predicts that someday they're going to forget all the good things that their dad has done for them. And they're going to speak indifferently to him. They're going to treat him like he doesn't matter. And after very long periods of time, sometimes hundreds of years of time, finally it will be enough. And God will punish. He will get angry enough to say, okay, I'm done. Stop treating me this way. There will be a chronic anger there. And the people will get angry at God for punishing them. He will get angry at them for being so indifferent to him. And so here we have it. This is a perfect idea of how we can see a biblical standard being presented in poetry. Now, let's look at another poem for a different kind of tone. This poem is called Winter by William Shakespeare. Yes, you get to read some Shakespeare this year. This won't be our only Shakespeare poem this year. You're also going to read one of his sonnets. But let's start with Winter because it's really, really well done. And I love it. So Winter by William Shakespeare. When icicles hang by the wall, and Dick the shepherd blows his nail, and Tom bears logs into the hall, and milk comes frozen home in pail, when blood is nipped and ways be foul, the nightly sings the staring owl, to whit, to who, a merry note, while greasy Joan doth keel the pot. When all aloud the wind doth blow, and coughing drowns the parson's saw, and birds sit brooding in the snow, and Marion's nose looks red and raw, when roasted crabs hiss in the bowl, the nightly sings the staring owl, to whit, to who, a merry note, while greasy Joan doth keel the pot. In class, this is usually when everybody looks at me and goes, what is this? Well, let's take it apart. That's how we learn. Come on, people. Let's talk about a couple of the phrases used here. Blows his nail is very simply what you're seeing on that far left-hand side. Blowing your nail means you're blowing on your hands to get them warm enough so that you can work with them. So blowing the nail. Bearing logs, taking firewood into the house. Keeling the pot means you are tipping your bowl or your pot toward you so that you can get the last drop of goodness. Okay? Now, the subject matter of winter has a very different tone than these winter Sundays. Winter can be seen as dreary, but William Shakespeare finds a merry note among the cold and inconvenience of chilly months. Outside things are foul, meaning yucky, windy, but inside you've got crab apples that are sizzling and getting cooked up so that people can eat them. People are drinking broth. The owl is singing, and overall they make it a merry time. They make the best of a very difficult situation. So let's take a look again with the very beginning here. Icicles hanging by the wall. This would be middle of winter when the snow has come and then melted and then come again and then melted, and the icicles just keep getting built up and built up and built up. You've got Dick the shepherd who is blowing on his nails to make his hands warm enough so he can work with the sheep. Tom bears logs into the hall, bringing in firewood. Milk comes frozen home in pail. I grew up on the Little House books. I love the Little House books, and they talk quite often about when Pa would go out and milk the cattle during the winter time, during blizzards even, and he would save most of the milk because as soon as he left the barn, the milk would freeze solid in the pail. They would actually have to warm it up, thaw it out before they could use it. Okay, blood nipped. You all know what that's like. Even in Southern California, we can get so chilly that we start to shiver a little bit. That's your blood being nipped. It's cold. And ways be foul. That means just yucky, just in a general ickiness. And then nightly sings the staring owl, to whit, to who. So even though all of this is going on, look at the next lines. A merry note. The to whit, to who is a merry note. It's like you're inside. Okay, your blood's nipped, you're cold, but now you're inside at night. And there's a merry note. While Greasy Joan, poor Joan, she got the bad name, huh? Greasy Joan. She doth keel the pot. She's drinking her broth by the fire that was created by Tom bringing the logs into the hall. And everybody's just relaxed and kind of enjoying themselves after the long day in the winter. Then we go on to the next section, the next stanza. It says, when all aloud the wind doth blow. Where we live, we hear the wind blowing quite often. It gets so loud. Remember in the classroom that one window was a little off kilter, and so when the wind blew that, it just whistled the whole time. And coughing drowns the parson's saw. Not a lot of respect for the parson's sermon here. That's the saw. The parson sawing or preaching a sermon, but in such a way that it's kind of on the boring side, and it's creating this kind of drowsiness, okay? But people can't even hear the parsons preaching over the coughing inside the church. Everybody's coughing. Everybody's got that seasonal cold. And birds sit brooding in the snow. These would be the birds that are kept. Okay, so they're domesticated animals, like, for instance, the owl or the chickens and the geese. They're sitting brooding in the snow. They're not very happy, but they're covered in feathers, so they're fine. And then poor Marion, everybody else has got the seasonal cough, but she also has the cold. So her nose is red and raw from blowing. But everybody gathered again in front of the fireplace. They're eating roasted crab apples. Those aren't actual crabs. These are crab apples or a fruit. They're hissing in the bowl and creating this lovely sound, and everybody gets excited because they hear it and they know they're going to have a treat. Then Knightley sings the staring owl, to-wit-to-hoo, which is a merry note. There you go. While Greasy Joan doth keel the pot. That idea of being together, still enjoying life, finding that moment of happiness despite the fact that everything outside is kind of cold and yucky. Okay, now that we know what it's about, let's go back and read it again. Here we go. Winter by William Shakespeare. When icicles hang by the wall, and Dick the shepherd blows his nail, and Tom bears logs into the hall, and milk comes frozen home in pail, when blood is nipped and ways be foul, then Knightley sings the staring owl, to-wit-to-hoo, a merry note, while Greasy Joan doth keel the pot. When all aloud the wind doth blow, and coughing drowns the parson's saw, and birds sit brooding in the snow, and Marion's nose looks red and raw, when roasted crabs hiss in the bowl, then Knightley sings the staring owl, to-wit-to-hoo, a merry note, while Greasy Joan doth keel the pot. Go ahead and look at this information again. I already read it to you, but when you do your homework, you're going to need it. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining me for our literature lesson online. This is our first one. Hopefully, we'll have some better times ahead of us, and we'll get together soon. But I just want to thank you for paying attention, and go ahead and do the homework that's in your book attached to these two poems. You could get them done right away if you want, while it's still fresh in your brain, and then email it to me. I will try to do like a digital format come pretty soon. So hopefully we can do grading that way to be a little easier. But thank you so much for your attention, and I will talk to you later. Bye.